I'm delighted to welcome you to our first summer learning programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics you have told us are of interest to you. Today's event is an introduction to delivery partnerships. Next slide, please. So the summer learning programme, it's brought to you by Homes England's new local government capacity centre. This summarises who we are and what we do. Can I just ask everyone to mute themselves, please? Thank you. So I'm just going to read this slide out. The Local Government Capacity Centre develops, curates and designs well-structured, accessible offers for local government, with an aim of increasing capacity and skills to make homes happen in the short, medium and long term. So this summer learning programme is one of our first initiatives, and we're starting small, but we have more to come. So there are a number of consultants who offer advice in this area, and today we are pleased to invite Avison Young and Pinsent Masons to share their insights on the subject, along with a range of panel members from across the industry. I'm now going to hand over to Scott Morrison and Stuart Howie to introduce themselves and run through the agenda. Scott.
Thanks, James. Could you move to the next slide? Thank you. So, morning, everyone. My name is Scott Morrison, and before we start, I'll introduce myself and Stuart. So, I'm a partner at Pinsent Masons, specialising in the structuring and delivery of delivery partnerships, and I've operated across this area for circa 20 years. Stuart Howie, my co-presenter for the first slot, leads the regeneration business of Avison Young and has acted in relation to delivery partnerships for a similar period, acting on both public and private sector side. Next slide, please. So turning to our agenda for today, we've split this into three parts. The first part is to run through our modern partnering survey. So last year we undertook, ourselves and Avison Young, across our clients and contacts, some research in relation to delivery partnerships, in terms of what works well, what can be done better, what are the trends, etc. And some quite interesting themes coming out of that, which we're going to run through as part of the first section. The second section is us looking at the delivery options, how you choose the right one, how you get to the right one, and how you get the deal done. And then the third section is a panel session, which will give you a practical perspective from the specialists in the area. So perhaps to start the actual presentation, if I could hand over to Stuart to walk us through the survey results.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be joining you today with Scott and our panel. And I was keen to give some of my experience of advising partnering transactions over the past 20-25 years today. But to start with, I think what this research and survey does is it's not just my experience or Scott's or the panels. The work we did has drawn on over 100 deals between the public and private sector, and the participants that we interviewed had over 500 years worth of experience advising on deals, and they had a collective development value of well in excess of £30 billion. So the point for mentioning that really is just to say this is a broad kind of industry view of life, local authorities, developers, investors and advisors. So that's worth bearing in mind. And obviously I see we have a range of scale of projects from quite interestingly polarised between sub 100 homes and over 1,000 plus. And so what I'm going to cover in this session is some key questions. Why do people partner? Why do they go to market? Why do local authorities go out to get a partner? What are the drivers behind that? We'll then touch on the pillars of success. It's amazing how there's some common themes from across those £30 billion plus worth of deals of both what works really well and needs to be put in place to deliver a successful partnership, and likewise the pitfalls, some clear common themes of things you will want to avoid and consider as you move forward. And then finally, we'll kick on to another Slido and ask you a few questions about what are some of the issues on the horizons for you as you consider partnering. So let's start with why partner. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of what people told us about the benefits that they were looking for when they entered into a partnership to deliver, whether that was housing or mixed-use development. There's quite a lot of different aspects that people are shaping for, so I'm not going to go through them all, but what I will do is kind of summarize them into sort of broad 3 categories and themes that we typically hear. First and foremost, and the most common and the highest on our survey, was about sharing risk. So this is about ensuring that the local authority driving the project isn't taking all the risk. It can have someone to help it share that burden. The second kind of theme that picks up on a few of these headings is around focus, about speed of delivery, about quality, and about value for money. And the very idea that there is a specific partnership form to make it happen creates the focus, purpose, and urgency to drive delivery. And the final theme, which is a really important one, is capacity and capability. People go to market for partnerships because they don't necessarily have the skills, the resources, perhaps the networks and ideas. So it's about finding the things that you need when you go to market. And for me, this highlights one of the key principles and themes that will keep cropping up today, which is be clear what you want from the market and why you want it, so that when eventually you come to selecting, for instance, a delivery option, it's tailored to your needs. It's not a cookie cutter. It's not just a model picked off the shelf that looks like it works elsewhere. It's very much about the right model that reflects what you need to get your delivery moving. Next slide, please. So our research also highlighted 4 themes and 4 key pillars of success. Next slide, please. So the first one sounds pretty obvious, but it's so important. If you're going to get what suits you, you need to go into it with a really clear vision of what good looks like and what you're trying to achieve. You also, the second dimension to this is about having the visibility. So when you sit the other side of the table from potential partners, they want to know who's involved, they want consistency, and they want to see that is supported and empowered to deliver. The next theme that came out is about the team. Forming any kind of partnership is a resource-intensive process. It's complex, so you need to be appropriately resourced, both internally and externally, to make sure that you're ready for that journey. And a couple of the words that jump off the screen for me are quality, so people that can do the job, but also continuity shouldn't be underestimated. The process of forming a partnership can take quite some time, and there's nothing more frustrating or less productive than having a constant churn within team members, whether internal or external. That just means everybody's constantly trying to get back up to speed, and potentially institutions forget lessons that they've already dealt with in a process. The third area of the theme, which is a really fundamental one as well, is preparation. This message just kept coming back to us time and time again. Be ready, do your homework. If you haven't got expectations that are clear, realistic and credible before you go to market, you're potentially set for difficult times in doing your transaction. So the market is not there just to test to see if it's a good idea. If you go down that route, there's potentially all sorts of troubles that lie ahead. So by the time you go to market, it's having a clear view. And again, if you don't have that clear view, a lot of messages back about the false economy of going to market too soon. So the final pillar, which is probably slightly less tangible than the first 3, but just as important, is the relationships, both within your team and across in partnerships as you go through this process. You spend a lot of time together, and actually you're setting up to run a longer term partnership. So it's really important that time and effort is spent on getting that chemistry right and just looking after it and making sure that the teams are working as effectively as possible. So those were the 4 common pillars that we identified. Scott's going to pick up now Sorry, Scott, I've given you the negative ones, but Scott's going to pick up on the pitfalls that we found when we did this work.
So thanks, Stuart. So we asked our survey respondents to look at and consider the kind of common pitfalls, and again themes I'm just touching on 4 themes that came out of that. Taking the first one on the slide there, changing requirements. There's lots of examples of this really, ranging from realizing that a particular element has not been included in the procurement and therefore having to retrofit it in, or being attracted by a particular bidder offer so that you lose sight of actually your objectives. And I was discussing this with Stuart actually, and I think a good way to illustrate it is when you have a builder to install a kitchen and you continuously change the spec all of the time during the job, then clearly there are implications to that. The most obvious one being that the price goes up. The second point, getting lost in the weeds. This is another really common issue, and we've all seen really onerous submission requirements in procurements. We've seen failure to tailor the procurement process and setting artificial deadlines. This has 2 implications really. It plays really badly in terms of the market and the bidders interfacing with your process, but perhaps more importantly, or equally importantly, you run the danger of losing sight of the actual deal and just getting bogged down in process. Move on to the next slide, please. The third theme that came out is just thinking that the partnership structure is a silver bullet. So taking an example, if the scheme's not viable, then the partnership structure or whatever structure you have, it's not a magic solution in itself to viability. You've still got to understand the viability of the commercial opportunities that underpin it. And then finally, as Stuart said, the last point, this is kind of difficult to evaluate, but intangible, but it's very important, the human side. And the relationship can be developed during the procurement process, but it's a critical success factor to a partnership. Move to the next slide, please. So we're into our second block of Slido. So if you could look at the question and tap in your response, that'd be great. That's interesting. A clear, as you would expect, clear majority showing greater demand for partnering. There's no surprise, I guess, but it's helpful that at least the topic of the conversation is in the right place. Maybe move on to the next question, please. That's interesting, the way that that's scaled out. I would have assumed that the capacity would have reduced. It's interesting. Spread across the 2. Okay, can we move on to the next Slido question, please? Okay, I think that's started to stabilise. If we can move on to the next slide, please. We'll pick up, as we go through, we'll pick up some of the themes coming out of the Slido, both in the presentations we go forward, but also in the panel session. But if I could pass back to Stuart now to look at the right delivery option and getting the deal done, which is the second, effectively, element of the presentation.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I think that was really interesting, actually, in terms of showing some of the trends and pitfalls. And going back to the original Slido, I think we've got an audience, quite a few of them are fairly new to partnering. So this second section of our training session today focuses on two things, really. One, it focuses on the process itself, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And then secondly, we're going to take a deeper dive into the individual delivery options to give you a feel for, what they are and how you go about picking the right one for yourself. So let's start with an overview of the process. We've broken it down here into, if you like, four simple steps. You'll find that when you do this in reality, some of these things blur slightly, but it's really helpful to think about where you are in the process and how prepared you are to move on to the next stage. So we're going to run through each of these in more detail, but think of the chronology of starting the process and knowing what you want and what you're trying to achieve, working out what you're going to do to make it happen, engaging with the market to find the right partnership to fill in the gaps and the areas that you can't deliver. And then a really important area, we'll come back to the end, is about actually, once you've established the partnership, it's not the end. It's actually the beginning of the next chapter. And because it is a partnership, you're still very much interested. So what do you need to be thinking about as that moves forward? So let's start looking at the goals and having a look at this. Next slide, please. So when you set out, before you even decided it is a partnership and which partnership it's going to be, what do you need to be clear on at the beginning? And in my experience, and again going back to the feedback that we've had, the clarity around what it is you're trying to achieve. I often say to clients, how will you know, or how will we know that this project has been successful? And we tend to get into a conversation about, well, in 5 years, 10 years time, what does it have to look like? What needs to have happened to know that it's been a success? And then what we can do is work back from that and start to work out what the journey looks like. But there's a real risk, in my experience, of people focusing on what they think they need to get there. So it might be more of an output spec rather than an outcomes spec. And one of the key benefits, as we've seen from the research of going to market, is that you're able to access innovation, ideas, different skills, and you very much want to feed that into your thinking to find the best way to deliver your outcomes. So I'd always recommend plenty of time is spent up front so that you can answer the question of how will we know we've succeeded, and make sure there's a shared view of that before you move on. And as I say, just running through the kind of some of the pitfalls and the top tips around this area is that really clear distinction between outputs and outcomes. Absolutely focus on the outcomes at the early stage. I would also say don't get too tied up in what you think you need to get there, but really focus on the destination. Another area where there can often be confusion for good reasons is that people have lots of competing asks around a project. So I've often talked to people, well, what do you need from this project? And I'll hear lots of things that are all legitimate, they're all absolutely valid and things we should be after, but they don't necessarily reconcile. So for instance, someone wants to maximize financial return. They might be seeking, I want capital receipts, I want revenue returns, I want to minimize risk, I want the best design and environmental credentials. You look at these in their own right, they are all things that should be factored in, but actually you can't maximize them all because they do trade against each other. So, for instance, the more financial returns I take, it probably means I'm taking more risk. So we need to find ways of calibrating this in due course. So let's be clear on what we really need. And the final point, just to really stress this as the key foundation, is your goals provide the golden thread. They are the foundation. So every step in the process, I'd always say, come back to what does good look like in a few years' time? How is it that we've embedded the golden thread of those outcomes all the way through, whether that's into our procurement design, our evaluation criteria, and ultimately, and Scott and his team can talk much better about this than I can, in the legal contracts. So where is it we can point to that we're going to get the things that we said we wanted and embed them in the actual legal structure and obligations of the partnership. So that's important to the goals. When you know what you want, it's time to consider then, if we move on to the next slide, your partnering needs. So what do we mean by your partnering needs? Well, there's a couple of aspects to this. We'll unpack this a little bit. What is it that you're up for, I guess, is the first and most important things. What's your risk appetite capacity as an organization seeking to achieve those goals that you've worked hard to clarify? What are you prepared to do to make it happen? Can you articulate that? When you start to look at how you're going to partner, which of the potential options we'll get into this in more detail, which potentially suit you. You'll need to go through both a qualitative and a quantitative process to really understand that the one you're shooting for works best. And then a really important point, which comes back to the credibility of this and not going to market too soon. Have you got some evidence that it's realistic what you're taking to market? It's deliverable. Because if you go to market with something that's fundamentally unrealistic, you will either get no response, you will get an answer that is no use to you, but you will not get what you've gone out for, and then you'll always be chasing the deal to try and get some sort of deal, and it's a route to burn money and end up in a situation where your goals aren't actually realised. Next slide, please. So when you're thinking about your partnering needs, what sort of questions should you be asking yourself to try and work out, firstly, what is it that you as an authority might bring to the partnership? And this is by no means a definitive list. It's just giving you a flavour of the sort of thought process to go through. But there's many things that you can bring. So it may be assets, it may be land, it may be your powers and influence, the fact that you are prepared to take risk. But it's very much taking almost like a stock take before you go into it, of saying, what are we going to do to make this happen? What are we prepared to put on the table in discussions to drive the project forward? Likewise, it's really important to reflect and consider we have certain skills in-house, we have certain capacity and assets in-house, we can do certain things, but we also have gaps, as would be expected for any local authority. So what is it that we're really seeking from the market and that any partnership might help us access? And there can be a range of things, varying from skills and expertise to capacity to manage risk. We may want their market insights and connections. We may want their money. We may want lots of different things from them, but having that clarity and thought process, because the market is not just a homogenous block of responders. There's a whole continuum of different types of players, and working out which part of the market might be more relevant to you is really helpful in thinking about which partnership and how do we design any procurement process. A couple other points is if you've got red lines, be clear about them early. So I often say to clients, think of issues in 3 buckets when you're working out your partnering needs. The things that we will always do and can't be persuaded on, let's be clear about them, put those down. The things we are never going to do and definitely want our partner to do, let's be clear about those. And then there's often the the middle bucket, which is, well, it depends. It depends on the deal we can get, depends on what it costs to transfer risk. And those are the areas where you'll typically spend more time discussing through any procurement process. And finally, there's the aspect around the role you take. Are you active or passive? Junior, senior, equal, and thinking about you may not have any pre-agreed positions on that, but thinking about it before you start engaging with the market to know whether you do have any positions. Next slide, please. And yeah, I'm not going to dwell on this one, but these are just a few lenses when you're thinking about both your position and your partner's position around risk capacity and risk transfer, different lenses to think these through, whether it's the financial or the economic. The only one I'll touch on is the reputational one at the bottom, because I think as local authorities, you're often in that challenging position of, even if you do a partnership, if it doesn't go well, you probably still have a certain amount of reputational link back to it. So when you're thinking about and working through with your teams, the structure of the deal, the cost of transferring risk, it's also worth thinking about, well, if it doesn't go well and we still have the reputational risk, was it worth us transferring that risk and structuring a deal in that way? So that's kind of an overview of how we get to that part of the process, and it brings you then into, we know our goals, we know what our partnering needs are. We now start to think about, okay, what do we want from the market and what's the right delivery option for us? So I'll hand back to Scott now.
Thanks, Stuart. Could you do the next slide, please? So in terms of looking at that question, let's start then with the delivery options, and then subsequently we'll look at how you choose the correct one, and then after that, how you actually deliver it. So we've sought to show on the slide there a continuum, if you like, a risk return continuum with low risk and low return at one side and high risk and high return at the other. It's all relative. It's a bit of a kind of overly simplistic representation, but it's useful to illustrate the point, and the various models all sit somewhere on that risk return continuum. So starting at the left-hand side, site disposal is effectively low risk, where you wouldn't share in the development return. Far right-hand side, direct development by the authority, higher risk there, but the authority would get all of the return or outputs. And then the joint venture and development agreement options sit within that. So I'm just going to explore each of those options, not in a great detail, but just to work out kind of where and why they sit on the continuum in the way they do. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the first one, which was, if you recall, on the left-hand side, on that risk return continuum, this is where the authority would choose to sell land to a third party. So in this context, the third party takes the development risk and the return. So there's very limited scope within that to control specification, etc. It's basically just a site disposal. Next slide, please. So moving along that risk return continuum, the development agreement is a scenario where the authority effectively sells land to a third party. But in this context, you would get a land value plus overage. You would be able to prescribe some obligations on the partner there, but in this scenario, you are passing the development risk to the partner, and the consequential return for that development risk goes to the partner. Next slide, please. The joint venture option is where the local authority chooses to set up a joint venture with the partner. So the JV in this context is the developer itself. The risk sits in the developer. And in this context, the local authority would, through that structure, if it's a 50-50, share in 50% of the risk through the joint venture, but also 50% of any returns that come through. Next slide. Then the final option, which is at the far right of the risk return continuum, is where the authority chooses either itself or through a wholly owned company to directly develop the scheme. And in that context, the council will take more risk. Obviously possible to set off some risk, construction risk to contractors, but ultimately the council's funding that, taking the predominance of the risk and any return and outputs that come through it. So those are the kind of different themes. There's lots and lots of different variations on a theme there. So we're not going into legal vehicles, and it's possibly overly simplistic, but it gives you an idea of how to look at these models on a risk return spectrum, as well as their ability to deliver your outputs and objectives, which we're going to move into next. Go to the next slide, please. So once you've actually identified the options that you're looking at in your outline business case, how do you then choose the right option? Well, the process that we adopt is to, as part of the options appraisal, is to have a qualitative assessment of the options. So we evaluate these options. You can see them on the left-hand side there: do nothing, sell, development agreement, JV, or direct developer, against at the top objective fit, strategic fit. These variables can change. It's always going to be the objectives, but the other variables will change specific to the circumstances. And then you're able to take an assessment of where that sits to give you an idea of what is the optimum solution. I'm just going to pass back to Stuart at that point to make some observations on the way that sometimes works.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. This is a really sort of telling slide for me, actually, because it highlights the challenge we often have and clients have when selecting a partnership. So if we look at the top couple of options, it identifies options that are fantastic for affordability, achievability. You know, one of them's commercially feasible. The only problem is it doesn't deliver what the organisations are there to do. And I think as public sector organisations, local authorities leading delivery, I always kind of think of objective fit and strategic fit almost as hurdles, because actually, unless they can work, they may be great in that they don't cost too much or aren't risky, but if they're not going to work, then the question is why are they on the table? Likewise, if you head down to the bottom, you know, the only way to really guarantee delivery is do it yourself, because, you know, there's market trends and nobody really wants to be building against the market. But the only way you can guarantee everything is to do it yourself. But clearly that means taking on all the risk, taking on all the costs and everything associated with it. And it's just, you know, often it's just simply not appropriate or realistic to do that. Hence why we come back to, you know, the continuum that Scott outlined, which is then calibrating, well, where are your trade-offs? You know, what can we do? What can the market do? Who does which bit better? And how do we find, you know, if it's a Venn diagram, if you like, a place in the middle of the Venn diagram where it works for us, it works for the partner, and in the middle, it delivers sufficient of the outcomes at an appropriate sort of risk and return balance that it's a good deal for all concerned. So if we move on to the next slide. So just in summary then for this part two, if we think back to the process of running this, the sort of the 5 simple steps here to keep in your mind as you go forward. So number 1 is those visions and objectives, getting really clear goals that are going to be laying the foundations for the success of the deal. Too often, if those aren't tackled early on, they lead to all the other issues around scope creep, misunderstanding between partners, inefficient procurement, and so forth. Once you've got your goals, be really clear on what you want and what you're prepared to do to make it happen. That's in your gift. So work it through, get a buy into that, and draw clear lines. You've then got the long list of potential delivery options. So you're thinking about how you go to market. You start with the long list. Scott's outlined there the qualitative review process. Some just simply won't work, so there's no point doing further analysis on them. Work out where you are on that continuum, which the runners and riders might be. You will then need a quantitative review to pare that down and work out what the sort of financial impact, the risk impact, to really quantify it and calibrate your cost benefits and other aspects and support your business cases and so forth. So if we go to the next slide, do you want to pick this up, Scott?
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so as you can see, we've gone with clients. There's quite a big process and a lot to do, a long way before you get anywhere near to the market. That takes quite a lot of preparation to do that properly and time to do it properly. So once you're at the point then when you've identified your model, you've mapped that out, you've got your business case, and you're next looking at your procurement phase, the first question, I guess, is, are you ready? And there's a number of different facets to that. The site, what are the constraints? Do you own it? Do you own it at all? If not, what's the acquisition strategy? The commercials, we've talked about the fact that there's no silver bullet through the structure. If the scheme's not viable, it's not viable. You need to understand what the implication of that is going to be on the procurement and how the market's going to respond to that. Picking up a number of the others, timetable. It's really important that you've got a carefully planned timetable against a critical path, and that's structured. All of the invitations are in the diaries of senior officers, not only for the meetings, but for the preparation, the evaluation, so that it's all very carefully planned. We've talked earlier about the issues that are created with timelines that are too long and that don't work effectively. The right delivery model, we've already talked about that, and the qualitative assessment required. The last one I probably want to touch on is governance. That's really important, not only the project governance, the procurement governance, but also the governance interfacing with the model, because we've found particularly that local authority governance often doesn't interface very effectively with some of these more commercially orientated models. So a number of factors to consider there. Next slide, please. So I'll just do this slide and then pass over to Stuart to finish off this section. Still on procurement, it's important that you do warm up your market, because are you going to have any bidders? That might sound simplistic, but at any one point in time, your scheme could be in competition with a number of others, and it's important to understand that, because some of these schemes are big and take a lot of resource from the partners, so they'll be selective about the ones that they want to select. Evaluation criteria, it's really important you get those consistent and linked to the contract. The key thing I always say to clients is that you get the answer to the question that you ask. So you need to really make sure that you've modelled your evaluation criteria and tested that what comes back through those is actually right and there are no perverse outcomes. Finally, on this one, keep it focused on the big stuff. You know, it's really important to keep in mind those key objectives and outputs and not lose that when you get into the weeds of all of the legal design and other detail in the procurement. So a number of things there that are really important, that they're not lost. Go to the next slide, please, and I'll pass back to Stuart.
Thanks, Scott. So I mentioned at the outset that getting your deal done just gets you to the start line of actually getting into delivery. And I think this is an area that came up through our research. It's come up, I've seen it many times over the years, that is often slightly forgotten in the excitement of the deal, let's say, because a lot of time and effort goes to the point of setting things up. But there's a few key areas where I kind of urge you to consider and plan before you get there. And those cover, what is your client function? So you may end up with a partnership that, you know, you have a share in, or it's a development agreement, whatever form it is. How will you as an organization monitor it, and ensure that it is delivering the value you expected to get from it. So that requires, back to the point Scott was making about governance, the governance needs to sustain once the deal is in place, and it'll evolve, but it needs to be appropriate and planned for and resourced. The second aspect to this, and again, it's another really common issue that I've come across, Scott's come across, and I'm sure many of the panel could talk about as well, is the corporate understanding of the deal. So these deals can be a long time in the making, and the advisors, the lead parties from the client and potentially from the developer do the deal, and then all disappear from the organisation over the next few years. And how do all parties ensure that the detail, the effort, the protections, the benefits that are encompassed in this deal are not lost to the organisation, because you can be left with quite big deal bibles, lots of complex documents. And for anyone who wasn't involved in the journey of setting these up, some of the nuances and understanding how to get the most from what has been agreed can sometimes get lost. So again, we sometimes look at things like training or simple handbooks to simplify it, so that there's an easy guide to understand what everybody's doing, what it's meant to deliver, and if it's not going fantastic, what provisions are in there to make sure we keep it on track and keep it delivering. So again, in summary, what I'd say is, any partnership, make sure that the transactional process and nature of forming a partnership isn't treated as what I call a fire and forget intervention. Once you've done the deal, it still needs that element of governance to make sure that it delivers value over the long term that these partnerships are typically set up for. So that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I appreciate we've covered an awful lot of ground without really scratching below the surface, but we were keen to show the process, lay some of this experience and understanding for your benefit. And what I'll do now is I'll hand back to Scott for the final Slidos, where we'll just explore some of the upcoming issues that may be in your mind or areas that most interest you, so we can be aware and Homes England can be aware for future training and sessions.
Thanks, Stuart. So we've got three more Slido questions, and then we'll move into our panel slot. So if you could get your Slido finger ready, that'd be great, and respond to that. Thank you. Okay, we go to, I'll settle down. Go to the next Slido question, please. That's a helpful perspective image. That'll just help Homes England identify what other areas would merit training. And then the final Slido question, you'll be glad to know. Great. Right. Could we go to the next slide? Okay. So if our panel attendees would be able to turn on their cameras and mics, that'd be great. While they do that, I shall introduce them. So we're lucky to have, first of all, Mary Parsons. So Mary has had over 25 years experience in development, construction and regeneration, working across both private, registered provider, as well as consultancy sectors. She's been involved in a number of the largest housing-led regen programmes in the UK. Mary's a trustee and chair of the Town and Country Planning Association, trustee of MOBI, which is an educational charity to promote housing, also a member of the University of Cambridge's Property Board. And Mary's had a number of roles, current and previous roles, in respect of different joint ventures with public and private sector partners. Julian Wayne's been involved in partnerships and joint ventures in regeneration development for nearly 20 years. He led for Solihull on the long-serving North Solihull Regeneration Partnership, subsequently worked with Gloucester Heritage URC and its successor bodies, worked on the Haringey Development Vehicle, and advised on a number of local authorities and partners on options for partnerships and regeneration. Currently, he's leading the procurement and setup of the Harrow Strategic Development Partnership. Ishdeep's director at Avers & Young, who specialises in advising public sector clients on the delivery and funding of large-scale housing, regen and infrastructure schemes. Ishdeep's a public sector SIPFA qualified accountant and started his career in local government, housing and regen finance roles, so therefore has a unique understanding of the financial and legal priorities that local authorities need to work within. Ishdeep's highly experienced and has established a number of partnership structures. So over the last 5 years or so has worked on 8 joint venture arrangements with a GDV in excess of £5 billion. And finally, Mona is a senior associate at Pinsent Masons, specialising in the delivery of partnerships, acting for both the public and private sector. Over the last 5 years, Mona's been involved in numerous schemes, for example, advising Basingstoke and Hampshire Council on their Money Down Garden Community Partnership with Urban and Civic, advising London Borough of Wandsworth on their Winstanley and York Road Estate Regeneration Partnership with Taylor Wimpey. So what we'll do, I can see we've had a number of questions. What we'll do is perhaps just start off by asking our panel if we could in turn to run through a few questions. Mary, perhaps if I could start with you, if I may. We've spent a lot of time in this session really looking at the local authority and the public sector viewpoint. Could we just turn the focus bit and just get your perspective on what the differences are from a partner's perspective, maybe by illustrating, entering into a partnership with a public sector partner as perhaps opposed to a partnership with a private sector partner?
Yeah, of course, Scott. I think really 2 things, and it's been touched on. It's pace and process. Because I think obviously the legals and everything end up being the same, but when you work in private sector to private sector, there's normally an existing relationship, and you've decided that there is, commercial and other corporate benefits for you joining forces. You either can do bigger or faster things, or it helps you diversify. So I think really the public sector ones, it's a bit of a different courtship. You've got this very sort of long chaperoned process when you're getting to know each other. And I think actually the risk is you end up obsessing on that process and not, as Stuart was saying, about that chemistry and the relationships and the sense that the people in it are going to work well together. And you did really sort of touch on it with the bit about, you get to the end of the procurement and actually that's a means to an end, not the end. I've likened it to the X Factor. You get all the energy of getting to the final and all the excitement and, everything, all the glitters going when you win it. That's meant to be the start of a sustainable recording contract career. And it doesn't often happen that way. And I think that bit about really focusing the energy, not to just get to when you set the JV up, but looking well beyond that as to how it works, to me is the biggest challenge for a lot of the reasons that you were both outlining.
Thanks, Barry.
Julian, perhaps I can ask you a question about the post-COVID world we've been in. So I know you've probably had to live it from a couple of dimensions. One, you've got an active transaction on the go. Secondly, you're in a local authority that's having to deal with lots of issues from a COVID perspective. So I'd be interested in any takes you may have on partnering in general and what it might mean for people thinking about doing one in one or beyond.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll take that in reverse order, if I may, Stuart. I mean, I think the experience of the last 18 months is that there's been a bit of delay. It slowed things down a bit, and obviously resources have been pressured. But by and large, we've kept moving, and we're going forward. In terms of deals, currently we might see some increases in costs, but nothing catastrophic. My view of the world looking forward, and I think to some extent it's been reflected by A, the attendance today, and B, what we saw on the Slidos. I think that there's likely to continue to be healthy demand for this. It's not just pandemic related. I mean, as I think many people on the seminar will know, local authorities haven't carried the skills for this sort of venture, and probably realistically can't be expected to. So I think there's going to be a need for resources. I don't see, notwithstanding the need to rebuild the economy, I don't see floods of public sector cash coming in. So I think spreading cost and spreading risk are going to continue to be important. And we've got this imperative to to deal with the challenges of our sites and our town centres and a continuing housing crisis. So for me, there's still going to be a lot of interest and a lot of appetite for this. No doubt we will see this being even more residential based, given the uncertainties about offices. And we were already got big questions over retail pre-pandemic, hadn't we? So, but I think the appetite is going to be there. Mary might be better placed than me to comment on how the private sector are viewing it at the moment, but I think there's still going to be some a robust market as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. I don't know, Mary, if you want to just chip in on the post-COVID point there was.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Julian's saying. There are a lot of potential opportunities around, and I think it is this bit about looking at the resources that the public sector needs and getting the right kind of partner for it. I think a lot of the private sector with some of the bigger opportunities are a lot more selective now. I think you sort of really have to focus on the opportunities that you really feel have the best fit. And one of the things you did really emphasize was that bit ahead of it come into the market, to engage with the market in shaping the thinking, but testing the appetite. And we certainly use that stage at Morgan Sindall to really try and get under the skin and be clear what the council's looking for, because I think that is key. I mean, I think the other thing, you touched on the huge resource implications for the public sector. It's the preparation, the intensity of the dialogue processes, if that's the route you go down. But bear in mind, for the private sector to bid something substantial, you could be in for over $250,000 before you actually win. That's a big commitment. You really do have to focus on the right opportunities and not scattergun with them now, because I think the intensity of what we're asked to provide sometimes, you do question, do you really need that bit of information now to make sure you've got the right joint venture partner? Wouldn't that be better that you do that together as a JV at the next stage? But yeah, the process is very resource intensive and heavy.
Yeah, really good point, Mary.
Okay, maybe we turn the focus towards the advisor's perspective for a few moments. Perhaps if I can ask you, Ishdeep, from an advisor's perspective, do you think that there are particularly important kind of roles and responsibilities of an advisor to a local authority in the context of what we're talking about today?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Clearly, I think it goes without saying that the core part of our role as advisors is to ensure that we secure the best financial, legal, and commercial terms for all our local authority clients, while ensuring that the procurement process itself is streamlined and market-facing, as others have said, to maximise the interest in the particular opportunity. Therefore, it's crucial that we support our clients from the early preparation stage right through to contractual close. But I guess one of the most important aspects for me as an advisor is to ensure that we provide council officers and members with the tools and understanding that they need to operate successfully during the operational phase of the partnership. You know, I find there's no point in us agreeing a set of contractual documents for our clients if those who over the long term will be working within those agreements don't actually understand the mechanisms and levers that, you know, they can pull for this benefit of the public sector, or an understanding of the key commercial risks and areas that they need to be challenging their private sector partners on. So I guess a real focus for me is, you know, knowledge transfer, and that must be at the heart of everything that we do as advisors, as that's a really important part of ensuring that the public sector can be a strong and successful partner within these types of arrangements. And I guess it goes back to, you know, things that both Mary and Stu have said. In order to be able to do that, the local authority needs to have a core team involved right from the outset and have that consistency and continuity there, because you won't be able to build the relationships, but you won't also be able to learn as you go. And we saw on the slide, I think, you know, 50% or over 50% of the audience don't necessarily have the experience in doing partnership deals, but also many more people are looking to enter into these contractual agreements. So we need to make sure that whatever we do, we are putting knowledge transfer at the heart of the advice that we provide.
Great.
Thanks, Steve.
So continuing on the theme of advisor insight, Mona, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on, you know, how authorities can kind of run an efficient procurement process, and any tips you may have.
I think I'd echo quite a lot of the results from the Modern Partnering Survey. It's certainly what I see in the market. I think the kind of pre-market stage is absolutely critical to getting yourself in a position where you can run an effective procurement process, including, as Ishdeep said, getting your advisors on board early to help you structure that. Where I've seen deals go to market too early, it certainly is a false economy, saving 1 month to add many months into the process once you're in it. And making sure that at the pre-market stage, you are asking for what you actually want in terms of your objectives, your evaluation criteria, and critically, that's also embedded in your legal documents. So there's not a kind of operation of silos, everything is fully pulled together and integrated. The second point I'd say is around, and it goes back to kind of pre-market work, is the timeline for the deal. I know that Scott's mentioned that as an important point, but sometimes there's a push to go for very, very ambitious timelines. And my view is that, you know, bidders are very sophisticated in knowing what timeline is achievable anyway. So I don't see a benefit in that approach. But also, from a planning perspective, if you're planning against a timeline that's not really going to work, then your cabinet approvals may be in the wrong times, and it just doesn't kind of give a credible position to the market, in my view. So I think if you can structure your timeline credibly, but in a market-facing way, that's a key one. I think Scott's picked up on, and I think you have, Stuart, as well, around changing priorities, and that again goes back to pre-market work. If you know what you want and you can cast that clearly, then you shouldn't be changing the goalpost in the process. And I think that goes back to kind of adding timelines in, adding some level of risk to the authority anyway, in terms of changing what you want. And the credibility perspective from the market, if you're changing the goalposts compared to what you've asked for. And I think the final one I had as a top one is the continuity of the council team. Is that, you know, that's an essential part of it, that you've got the right knowledge from the entire process, and in particular having a strong authority lead appointed to give direction in the procurement process, to be able to be directive in dialogue meetings. I think they're my critical points.
Thanks, Mona. Great. So I think if we start to pick up some of the questions that have been coming through, the first one I'd like to probably address at Mary and Julian is to just look at the kind of, well, the questions around the role of members in JV governance. I'd probably like to widen that and just look at how important governance is as a whole, and probably, Julian, from your perspective, I think the interface between a local authority governance mechanism and one of these commercial vehicles? And maybe Mary, from your perspective, from a bidder perspective, how important it is to see that the governance interfaces and what you would like to see. So perhaps Julian, if you could start off, and then we pass over to Mary.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I mean, I think there are probably 4 key aspects to this. I'll try and be as brief as I can on them, but I'll try and pick up your interface point as well. I think the first point is in the establishing the objectives, establishing what you want to do point, and getting the start of the process. Member involvement there is absolutely critical. You need your administration completely on board. They need to understand what they're taking on. You need to get as much consensus within that group as you possibly can. And although we live in a political world and we're not naive enough to believe you'll necessarily get the opposition on board, you need to at the very least brief them and make sure that they're aware of what's going on. This plays well against the private sector. It will also save problems down the line, and that's an absolutely critical first step. Second part, I think, for me, is the procurement process itself. For me, the member role there is to agree the launch, to agree the various stages, preferred bidder, appointment, etc., and to receive briefings. For me, and I think there is procurement law logic to it, not that I claim to be a procurement lawyer. Where members don't have a role is in the evaluation and the procurement piece. There is to approve the results of the process. I think then you move into the post setup world, and I think there's 2 aspects to this. The first is that there's the internal decision making, and of course this is mirrored in the private sector partner as well. Typically in these these partnerships, there are decisions, and the best example might be approving the business plan, decisions that will be reserved to the council and to its partner, and you need to be clear who, how and what is going to take those decisions, so that the decision making flowing back into the partnership is appropriate. I mean, typically, using the example I gave you, the cabinet is the right place, and certainly there's a very important member role here. So members taking those internal decisions. I think the final key issue, of course, is board membership, and this, of course, is the area where you get all sorts of different views, different complexities. There are views, including espoused in recent reports on local authority companies, that actually members shouldn't be on the boards. I understand those views. Actually, putting officers on those boards brings conflicts and difficulties of itself. So I don't think the answer is straightforward, and I don't think it's as straightforward as it's sometimes portrayed. My own view, and this is supported by a number of chief executives I've worked with, is that providing members are appropriately trained, it is better to put them on the board than it is to put officers, because I think you end up with more problems when officers are trying to advise with different hats on. Personal view, and I do appreciate that others will hold different views. I'm not sure if I've covered your point about the integration, but I think the way I would characterise it is that, you know, the board is an independent partnership. Depending on what structure you usually take, the board must take its own decisions, but the key interface is those decisions that are reserved to go back to the partners as members of the partnership, and it's really important that that decision making is taken slickly, efficiently, clearly, and in the appropriate political level. I suppose the other thing important to say is that, of course, the roles of audit committees and scrutiny committees is very important as far as the council's input is concerned. What is the council doing? The partnership itself holds its own brief on its own auditors, its own documentation, etc. Sorry, I fear that was quite a long answer, but it is a complex subject.
No, thanks, Julian. No, I think it was a good answer. And Mary, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think we're going to have probably the first point of disagreement in the whole conversation about the role of members on the board, because I think a lot of the private sector, you look at examples like Haringey and so on, local politics is always going to be one of the key things that we would look at in terms of if you're forming a 15, 20, 30-year joint venture. Is there stability? And if there isn't stability and it's a hung council or whatever, is there cross-party support? Are the members buying into it? And I think that's the biggest thing that they need to. They need to see what is the JV trying to do. If it's delivering more homes that are needed in an area, then they get behind it. I absolutely agree with their roles to sort of support and to give scrutiny and everything on the council side. But I also think there's a bit of managing expectations. I mean, we've had quite a few when you come out of 12, 18 months of procurement and legals, and it's like, right, when are we on site? It's like, oh, give us a chance. We've got to work there. And in terms of their roles on the board, I don't think you should bring politics into what is effectively a corporate vehicle, a 50-50 corporate vehicle. And they are going to have different rounds of elections and so on within it. You can't risk the JV becoming a political football in any shape or form. So I think, having their support, having, whether it is in more of a sort of strategic and the business planning role, I've seen that work incredibly well, that there's a sort of strategy board that wraps around it where they can really have their say and the partner can understand what's important in an area. But yeah, I think the key thing from a governance point of view is that the people that go into the JV board are actually empowered from both organisations to be able to act in its best interest, that they feel they've supported, that they're at an appropriate level within, whether it's the council or the partner, to make the decisions that they're empowered to do. Because I think the bit about conflicts and so on, I accept your point, Julian, but I think you can work around that.
Excellent. Thanks, Mary. And I'll say I've got my own views about segregations of duty and how you plan for all the governance between the client interface and things, but for another day, I suspect. I just going to move on with a quick question for the advisors, and it was one around. We've had a question saying, do all partnerships have to be 50-50? So maybe I'll come to you first, Ishdeep, on that one.
Yeah, sure, Stu. So I guess there's probably the two aspects to that, aren't there? I think that the specific question in the chat was around risk and reward as well, and whether it needs to be 50-50 or whether you can do it in a different way to alter that balance. And I think from my perspective, there's one element around decision making and one element around actual risk exposure in terms of your financial risk exposure. So from, one of the key aspects of a corporate 50-50 joint venture is making sure that you have full alignment of objectives and equal control over the vision and delivery and the decisions that are being made to bring these schemes forward. So I think, having that 50-50 partnership structure works really well to maintain that equality. If you're moving away from that, with the partner taking a greater percentage role, then clearly that dilutes the benefit of going down a 50-50 corporate joint venture route. And in reality, you may wish to consider an alternative route to market. However, I guess in terms of the risk and reward aspects, depending on the commercial realities of the deal, you're quite able to arrange the financial contributions of each of the partners to change the risk balance for the public sector. So, for example, if you have sufficient land value, a local authority may be able to just invest its land as its equity without putting any additional cash into the deal, with the partner putting the cash requirements into the vehicle. They will, of course, take a higher priority return on that non-matched equity that they have put in, but that does clearly reduce the financial exposure to the public sector. So I guess, if you want a partnership where you have equal decision making and equal control, you can structure the arrangements in a way that you maintain that control, but reducing your risk exposure. So it very much depends on the deal and the scheme going forward. But if you do not want equal control, then I think there's probably other appropriate routes to market.
Thanks, Ishdeep. So a number of topics coming up on the chat. There's one there that is always topical around viability, and there's a number of viability questions, but there's one there that from Carolyn Barnes, which talks about where the initial viability is marginal or poor. How about trying to achieve a situation where a patient investor is involved? So I think perhaps, Mary, if we start with you, I guess in the context of some of these schemes, it would be very nice to see a patient investor.
Yeah, and that goes back to the picking your partner, because if you get to the end of a process and you end up, with a house builder that's got a short-term profit model, it isn't necessarily going to structure it in the same way. I think the general viability point, one of the things that I think JVs can have a real benefit is you can actually take a portfolio of assets. So instead of just looking at each individual site, hitting all the buttons in terms of viability, you could look more strategically, and you could have a couple of really strong ones and then a couple that your partner's accepting is marginal viability. And as long as you're looking through the business plan at something that is a deliverable portfolio of sites, you can manage that. So actually these vehicles can be a very good way of helping along some of the individual sites that were struggling. But that does take me to a point I think someone else made about, benchmark land values and so on. If you're taking that approach and you're expecting your partner to work on that basis and be patient and have capital out for a longer time and so on, while it's doing heavy lifting of planning and dealing with site abnormals, don't benchmark it each individual site as, well, if I put this site on the open market, someone would pay more money for it, because that's not best value, which is what these joint ventures have been set up to achieve. And to be honest, if there is one frustration, and I think, Stuart, you were making the point about how the JV knits back into the council's governance and approvals process, it's that. It has to have that, you are procuring a partner that has been fully market tested, that is demonstrating best value, that is demonstrating market facing return. So when you actually look at how you assess is it value for money, start from the same place. If you want a scheme with policy compliant affordable housing or to deliver some special needs homes, don't benchmark it that you put it on the market and a volume house builder buys it with a view to dialing down the affordable housing, for example. And that's where most of those issues, and I'm sure Julian would agree on that, it's getting that balance of the JV genuinely delivering best value to the authority and not taking the mick, which has been known as, but it is that bit about judge it fairly and have faith in the process that you've procured will give you best overall value.
Yeah, great perspective. Don't know whether anyone else wants to come in on viability. Throw that open.
I'm happy to share a view, Scott, if that would be helpful. I think one of the critical things is that some of the the main town centre regen schemes that have quite a lot of land assembly infrastructure requirements are inevitably going to be difficult from a viability perspective, and a lot of the times actually the aspiration and the vision of the site is very different to what the current environment is like. And therefore, when you're doing a viability assessment, there needs to be a bit of pragmatism in working out what values you're using for those viability assessments, because clearly today's values are not going to be what you hope to achieve by the regeneration effect, the placemaking that will be delivered. And therefore, you need to take a slightly different view to viability. And in reality, that also means there's a specific type of partner who will, who you will need. It might not be Mary, it might be somebody else. But likewise, it could be Mary and not another person. So you need to be able to target the opportunity to the right players. And those who are focused on regen have got a much longer term viewpoint, and therefore viability can be looked at in a multitude of ways.
Scott, very briefly. One of the things that Mary's point really reinforces is the need for comprehensive briefing. I'd almost go as far as to call it training, actually. In one or two places we've done a bit of this, actually, in some instances go back to the very basics of the development economics and say, this is what it means, this is what you're procuring, this is how it'll work. So that when you're coming to make these decisions, you are actually comparing apples with apples and taking board members of whatever hue and relevant senior officers through the process to make sure they understand it. It comes back to Ishdeep's earlier point about knowledge transfer. It's really important to deepen the understanding.
That's a great discussion. Last one, really, Mona, just before we wrap up the panel. I think there's a question there around setting things up to avoid future things like state aid and maximising funding. It's probably worth just talking about how you would approach that.
Yeah, probably worthwhile highlighting, obviously, the state aid rules have been replaced since the implementation period of Brexit by the subsidy control regime, and that at the moment that's a very high level regime, but the default position is looking back at state aid. That's what practitioners are doing. The typical arguments we use in these types of deals is that the council are investing on equivalent terms to the private investor, and therefore there's no advantage given to the market. So that's your general premise, and that still stands true under subsidy control. There's very similar premises to what you may know as MEIP or MEOP, the market economy investor principle. There's also the question of, if you're trying to get cash into the JV without a return, there might be viability issues, might be certain reasons, there can be issues around that, and how can you structure that in a way that's compliant? Can it be done out with the JV through investment into infrastructure? Can it be done through investing into an RP, grant funding an RP? So there's a variety of different structures depending on where you need to get to seek to ensure that you have a state aid subsidy control compliant solution.
Great, thanks Mona. And Stuart, can I just hand back to you to maybe finish off with a few closing comments?
Yeah, a few final words, and firstly, just on behalf of the audience, my thanks to the panel for some excellent discussion there and insights. So really appreciate you taking your time today. So just a few sort of takeaways and thoughts that, a couple of themes that I've picked up that run throughout the presentation and the questions is, there are no shortcuts. This is not about cookie cutters and picking a model off the shelf. You need to work through the process with the clear goals, understand your needs, get your stakeholders aligned, including the members, prepare clearly, because we've heard from both public and private sector the value of running an efficient process. Spending time in dialogue, is needed and productive, but it's not an industry in its own. It's a means to an end of getting to the start line, and it's in everybody's interest to make that work as effectively and as efficiently as possible. And don't forget, once you have started, the governance, protecting value. Make sure you play your part as a part. Are we supporting it in the way we said we would? Are we giving them what we said? So in terms of wrapping this up, as James said, we will share the slides. There's also going to be a follow-up, I understand, in a couple of weeks' time, where we'll also bring together a fresh kind of one-pager, if you like, which summarises a few of these points and a few of the top tips that you've heard today. We're also, keep your eyes out, we're also launching a portal around partnering, where we're going to capture some of this information, stimulate some of this debate. We haven't even touched on, how do you get more social value into your partnership? How do you make developments greener, etc., etc. So many issues that are going to shape future partnerships. So we'll put a link to that so that you can see what people are saying, join in the conversation. And finally, just a thanks to the teams that supported us pulling this together, from both Vincent's and Avison Young on the slides and the technical side, and Scott's team.
Thanks to everyone. So thanks to Scott, Stuart, Mona, Ishdeep, Mary and Julian. That was a fantastic talk and the panel was really interesting.